So, hi everyone, it's Nina Collins here at the Woolfer, and we're here today in conversation with Brooke Warner. Brooke is a publisher. She's the publisher of a company called She Writes Press and also Spark Press. She's also the president of Warner Coaching Inc., which we'll ask her about. She's the author of a number of books herself: Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, How to Sell Your Memoir, the co-editor of a book called The Magic of Memoir, and the co-editor of Breaking Ground on Your Memoir. Brooke has a long history in book publishing. She was the former executive editor of Seal Press, which is now part of Hachette, I believe, and
Right.
sits on the boards of the Independent Book Publishers Association, the Bay Area Book Festival, and the National Association of Memoir Writers. She also writes a monthly column for Publishers Weekly, which I read because I get Publishers Weekly. And She Writes Press, actually, I just noticed, won a big award, right, for being, let's see, the first hybrid imprint to win the 2019 Independent Publisher of the Year award. So I thought welcome. I'm so glad.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice of you to make the time. And the Woolfer community is a lot of writers, a lot of women who really love books. We have a daily, as you know, writers' room Monday through Friday that Tulani runs. And always from the very beginning, when it was What Would Virginia Woolf Do, I used to say in the early days, I think the bulk of our members were writers or kind of people in the writing community. So I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with you to introduce all of our listeners to the whole concept of hybrid publishing, and for you to kind of explain, because the publishing world, when I was in publishing, when I was an agent, it was mainstream publishers, and then there was the emergence of self-publishing, which was still kind of slightly awkward and not that. And then through the 90s and into 2000 was when like the Celestine Prophecy was a big hit, and self-publishing became kind of big and popular. And now you're doing something called hybrid publishing. So can you tell us what it is, how it differs from self-publishing? Tell us a little bit about your model.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Hybrid publishing, we talk about it as a third way, and it is situated somewhere between traditional publishing and self-publishing. And there are many hybrid publishers out there with different kinds of hybrid models. And for that reason alone, I think it is kind of a gray zone, because we're not all following the exact same model or the exact same royalty structures. But the gist of it is that a hybrid publisher would be a publisher like us who requires the author to invest in the project, right? So it's author subsidized. And in that way, it can and never will be or I'm saying it cannot and will never be traditional publishing, right? Because the author is investing in themselves. The ways in which it's very much not like self-publishing, however, is all of the mechanisms that make us a publisher. We have a vetting process, so we don't accept everything. Very importantly, we have traditional distribution. And I think that's probably the number one thing that matters. And especially you having been an agent, and lots of times agents bring us their projects that they can't sell traditionally because they know the value of traditional distribution, which is that pipeline that brings books into the marketplace in a really meaningful way. And so we pre-sell our books, and we have a sales force that goes out to the marketplace. Exactly. And that is super meaningful to authors. I mean, for me, that's the thing that sets us apart, because my entire goal was to level the playing field for indie authors, but you can't level the playing field if you don't have distribution.
No. So all of your books go through Ingram, I think, the distributor?
It's Ingram Publisher Services, which I only distinguish because Ingram has so many branches, and a lot of self-published authors are like, well, I have Ingram. And the answer is yes, they do, but it's a different branch of Ingram. And so our branch of Ingram is a sales force that is actively pre-selling books into the marketplace. And then, we of course have to pay a commission to them for that privilege. But it is a traditional distribution arm of Ingram.
So if you're published by She Writes Press, all of your books are available in the same way that a book that's being published by Random House is available.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So the books get into bookstores, obviously, but importantly, libraries and other markets. And then the other thing I think that's really meaningful is that we get traditionally reviewed. And when I'm talking about, Kirkus, Booklist, Library Journal, PW, where self-published authors get siloed into these special self-publishing spaces. And while that's really great in some way that there is that opportunity for reviews, it's still this way that publishing loves to segment the industry in such a way that it ends up being detrimental to self-published authors in ways that they might not realize.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it was one of my questions. Like, would you say the She Writes books are reviewed across the board in the same way that, say, a book from Hachette is, or is it much less? Like, kind of, where do you fall in that continuum at this point? I mean, I should also say you've been in business for 9 years, right? So
Right.
it's really changing. I mean, I'm sure it gets better and better every year.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, part of that is the reputation of She Writes in our books. And prior to founding or co-founding She Writes Press, I worked in traditional publishing for 13 years. And one of the imprints I worked for was Seal Press, which, funny enough, is now an imprint of Hachette.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a better analysis to compare She Writes Press to a small imprint, not to the big four at this point, because
Yeah.
if you have a Simon and Schuster book, for instance, that has a lot of money behind it, that book is going to get really widely reviewed simply for being under the label of Simon and Schuster. But smaller imprints a lot of times have these, like good reviews, well reviews, like, I don't say well reviews, that's not a thing. Well received. Yes, they're well received, and I guess what I'm saying is, like, some of our books get that kind of attention, some and not all, but that is true of any imprint.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, even when you're published by Hachette or Random House,
Right.
a lot of those books don't actually get a lot of review attention. So,
Right.
But you're right. It's a good point that we should be comparing you more to a small press, like
a Grey Wolf or New World Library, or these we're indie. We're not part of the big. Obviously, we're not in any way, shape, or form a corporate publisher, but we are doing a lot of books, because we publish about 80 to 90 books a year, which is a substantial sized list. And so it places us in kind of a midsection in terms of who we might see as our, friendly competition.
Yeah. Now, I looked at your website. I mean, you and I have obviously spoken before, but I was really studying your website this morning, and I didn't realize you have like a standard package, right? So it's $8,500. An author pays $8,500 and then retains 60% of the net profits of the book, 70% of the net profits on ebooks. The cost of printing and of printing galleys or advanced reading copies, ARCs as they're known in the business, is on the author. Is that correct?
Right. That does fall to the author. And thank you for mentioning it, because the final point I wanted to make about hybrid is that the authors, of course, retain the lion's share of their royalties, which is a really important point and should be the case, right? It's commensurate with the risk that the author is taking on the financials. And so then the earnout is much stronger than it would be at a traditional house. And so what I always say to people who publish with us is that your goal ought to be to earn out your expenses. If you make any profit, awesome, that's gravy. But that's the same goal that most publishers have. When you're doing your P&L, you want to recoup your expenses. And then if the books do well beyond that, that's great. But most publishers are operating on the premise that a few of their books are going to break out and pay for the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who are not in the publishing industry don't understand that. They don't understand how rare it is really for authors to make money on books. I mean, generally it's a losing proposition, overwhelmingly. I think it's probably fair to say that. And it's true, most like big publishers, they pay advances that don't earn out. It's very, very, very common.
Absolutely. I was going to say that is why the advance, of course, is attractive, but it's a complicated thing for authors, because authors are like, oh, all I want is an advance and a big publisher, and all of that can be really good. And there's a downside to taking those big advances if your book doesn't earn out, because you can get yourself in a position where your next book then is, I hate to use the word pariah, but that's what comes up, is that authors become.
It's absolutely true. I mean, I'd say my book, What Would Virginia Woolf Do, was published by Hachette, and they paid $75,000, which was lovely. But it didn't earn out, and it will make it harder when I want to sell another book. And that's really very, very common. And how much does it cost typically for people to print the books? So if it's $8,500 to kind of get in the door, and is that true for everyone across the board? Is that like a?
That is true for, yeah, we only have one package. We don't do these tiers like a lot of other companies do, intentionally so. We're not trying to have like a menu list of items. We want to give everybody the same treatment and the same opportunity. And the printing is going to vary, of course, depending on how many copies you print, because the least amount of copies that our authors normally print is 500. The most amount, we have a handful of authors who might do 2,000 to 3,000. And then there are reprints, of course.
Right.
Some of our authors do go on to, when I say breakout, I'm talking about selling, upwards of 7,000 to 10,000 copies. And we have a handful of authors who have done that.
That's
But
great.
yeah, it is. It's amazing. But most authors sell around 1,000 copies, or in that ballpark is kind of what we're hoping for. And so a lot of this is also about tempering author expectations, because authors think I'm going to sell 10,000 copies and they don't recognize just how many books 10,000 is, or how many readers 10,000 is.
Right.
So
It's really refreshing, Brooke, I have to say, because it's, I mean, we haven't even gotten to the fact that you're publishing all women, and I'd love to talk a little bit about where She Writes originated. But to be so transparent and to be really supporting women and to be really explaining the process, I think is just, I mean, it's a wonderful gift that you're offering people, because it's true. Authors, again, they don't realize that, when you say some of your authors sell 6,000 or 7,000 copies, I know from being in publishing, that's not a bad number. I mean,
yeah.
there's a lot of books that have come out that that people that sell a few thousand copies, which is a big loser for publishing houses. But in this case, it's, again, you're managing expectations and doing it in a reasonable way. Let me get back to some of the nitty gritty. So do you publish any men?
Not on the She Writes imprint. So we do have a secondary imprint, which is smaller and publishes about a fourth of the number of books every year, called Spark Press.
Mhm.
So I kind of feel good about that, because always a man in the audience somewhere raises their hand and they're like, how can I be on She Writes? And I can at least say we have another imprint, but She Writes is exclusively female authors, or female.
Okay. Female identified. Okay. And what is Spark Press? What is the mandate there?
Spark Press is a little more of like a commercial press, that we do a lot more genre fiction on that side. We do YA and middle grade. And although She Writes occasionally does YA, it's not very common, and we don't do any middle grade. So yeah, it's the hard thing about putting them side by side is that they have some overlap. They overlap in commercial fiction. But Spark Press decidedly does more genre, YA, and middle grade, and then we also publish men.
And did you create it specifically so that you could publish men sometimes?
No, so that goes to the origins of the company, which is that Kami Wyckoff is my co-founder in She Writes Press, and we started it together independently. And then we met Crystal Patriarch, who is the current CEO of She Writes Press now, and
Okay.
she had her own imprint called Spark Press. And when we met, we realized we were doing something really, really similar. And she is a publicist and I'm a publisher, and we kind of needed each other's skill sets. And so it was a merging of the two companies. And so I essentially inherited Spark Press.
Got it. All right.
But now they have the same model.
Okay. And actually, Kami is how you and I met. And I know, so did Kami, because I don't really remember the exact story. I didn't know Kami back then, but She Writes originally started, as I understand, as a community for women writers. Is that right?
Yeah, she started it as a salon, and it quickly became very, very popular. I mean, it was an online platform, but there were meetups all over the country. And I think within the first month, there were something like, I want to say 2,000 or 3,000 members. And it grew very, very, very quickly. I think kind of overwhelming to Kami in a sense, and it was really exciting. And She Writes, I knew about She Writes because I worked at Seal Press, which is a women's imprint.
Right.
And so I heard the buzz with almost immediately, oh my gosh, this women's community is starting and it's so supportive. And I knew Kami from running just in women's publishing circles, so that when I decided to leave Seal and I wanted to start my own thing, I knew that I didn't just want to strike out and like start an imprint. And it just seemed so obvious to me that building a press on top of this pre-existing and very popular community would be a no-brainer. And I also really liked Kami. You know,
Yes.
she's down to earth. We share values, you know, like it was kind of an easy, I could easily imagine myself doing this with her. So I did pitch her on the idea, and that's how it all started.
For you. It's a really good, it seems like a really sensible business model. It's great. And do you, as you've grown, I guess you must struggle a little bit with kind of wanting to become more like a mainstream publisher. Like how does that tension work for you? Like how often do you reject authors? How often do you, are you really looking for submissions from agents, or are you really generally getting submissions from the writers themselves?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that I actually have no desire to be like a mainstream publisher, because I come out of that space and I was so disillusioned, you
Yeah.
know, and I gave a TEDx talk for people who are interested. You can listen about what I call the green light revolution. I just know all of these creatives, creative people, right, who have amazing projects, and they just don't need or want the legitimacy of the
Mhm.
mainstream publishing world. And I think that because I was deeply entrenched in all of that dysfunction for so long, I'm not pushing for She Writes to be that. You know,
Right.
what I do want is for our books to be judged on the merit of the books alone, which publishing has a really hard time doing.
Yeah.
And so I am an advocate for authors and this idea that I talked about earlier of leveling the playing field and judging the book for the freaking book, you know, and not the author itself, which is so often what happens, you know, where it's about the author fame and celebrity and their platform and who are they. And then this is contributing to the celebritization of book publishing. And so I like being in this indie space, and we will always only acquire books based on the writing alone, not on author platform.
Great. Wow. And how often, how many editorial, is your editorial staff full time or is it freelance? Because I had a friend who was working for you freelance for a while. How does your acquisition staff function? And how often
Yeah.
do you reject things?
So I'll start with the rejection part. We have 4 tiers. And so they're simple, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the first 2 are acceptance. You know, you're accepted, or we think that you need a line edit before we will publish you. Lots of people come having been agented, having already hired their own copy editor, maybe 3 times it's been edited, right? So some of them really are just ready to go. And we give every book a proofread. We may determine that you need a line edit. And so those are the people that are freelancing for us. We freelance all of our copy editors, developmental editors. So our in-house program really is a staff of, I have 3 project managers, you know, so they're shepherding the books through the editorial process, but they're not line editing the books.
But they're the people who are deciding what to take on.
Yeah, well, and there are 2 other people I also employ. So my editorial staff of 3 plus 2 people who have previously been agents. Which it's always great to hire people who used to be agents, because they know what the industry wants. You know, they know how to read for acquisition. So I have a team of 5 who, and then once they do the assessment, then someone else checks their work to make sure that we agree that it should be on tracks 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then 3 or 4, I talk about 3 as kind of a soft rejection. It just means it's good. It has a lot of potential, but it's not ready for publication. You need to go back and really work on it, not just a line edit, but more of a developmental edit or even an overhaul. And track 4 is just, we can't even take it. Like, it's stream of consciousness. It's not even a book yet. You know, we get those kinds of projects that we're just like, we don't have the bandwidth to even try to partner you with a developmental editor because you just sent us your journal, you know, so those kinds of things. And I think, you know, we try to be really kind and helpful and send people off in a way that, you know, is saying, look, you can work on this. And I think people truly appreciate that, because they, again, back to the transparency, if they want to continue to work on it, they can always resubmit.
Right. It sounds like a loving process, basically. Pretty kind.
Yeah.
Um, but of course, again, having been an agent and worked in that business, I know about, you know, how much stuff you get kind of over the transom. So I would imagine, do you have statistics on kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, or is that too private to
I
reveal?
mean, loosely, I would say somewhere in the ballpark of 20% probably qualify on either 1 or 2.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, And so that, but even still, given the volume of our submissions, that
Yeah.
ends up being a lot. We get a lot of submissions, and so we also can't publish everyone. You know, we're only doing 40 books a season.
Right. So what do you do when you really, I mean, do you just push it ahead? If you like something and want it and think it's good, you'll just
We
push it to
don't, you know, we don't push it to the front of the line. I mean, a lot of people tried to argue with me, this is timely, it needs to be on this list. And I feel like I can't really accommodate those people. I mean, there's been one instance, I think, where we crashed a book. And it was because the author was previously published with us and there was a timing issue around some historical event. But for the most part, I do think of us as like a fairly democratic process, you know, that you don't cut the line, right?
Yeah,
And that you
yeah.
wait, and if people are really know what they want and understand what they're getting into with us, then they can sign the contract and be on the next list. But it is getting increasingly more difficult because we're like right now we're acquiring for fall 2022.
Wow.
And
So
for
it
some
really is dragging.
folks, that feels hard.
Yeah, that feels hard to wait. And
Yeah.
so what are your goals for the company in the next 5 years? Like, do you think it will stay the same size?
Yeah, I do. You know, I think my ongoing goal, and it's been the same since day one, is just working to get legitimacy for our authors, you know, that our authors be seen as any other traditionally published author in terms of the quality of the work itself. And so for me, it's all about more reviews, more visibility. I'm not interested in growing the imprint to be bigger because I don't think that that is helpful from a quality perspective.
Okay.
And we're a small team. And, you know, I worked my first job in publishing, I worked 5 years for an imprint called North Atlantic Books, and they're a very similar size. And for as long as they've been around, they've done about 80 to 100 books a year, you know, and I feel like that's our sweet spot, you know, 80 to 100, that's what we can handle. And so it's all about just, you know, always more, you know, better quality,
Quality.
you know, just in and increasing our and stabilizing, I guess I would say, our reputation. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to bookstore owners, just all of the things to just kind of tighten the reins of our process.
Right. Well, I would imagine, I mean, it must be 9 years is a considerable amount of time. And you must feel the success and the kind of credibility and the stability year after year, I would think, right?
100%. I used to be such a fighter, you know, like in the first 3 years, I was always in the trenches, getting into arguments with people, you know, just saying like, oh, well, you know, trying to prove myself.
Legitimate. Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
like we are okay, you know, and I don't do that anymore. You know, like when people don't get it, I'm just like, you don't get it, and you can look into it more. I mean, you can read our books, they speak for themselves, and you can see our sales. And so it's so rewarding because the authors and the books now are my proof.
That's
You know, so
great.
I don't have to rail against things quite so much, although I occasionally can get into it.
What's the hardest part about what you do?
That's a, you know, it's hard because I think the hardest part is both the hardest and the best, which is the author relationships. You know, like I have amazing author relationships, and authors can be really challenging, as you probably know, you know, and really holding my ground to say you are not making the best choice for your book right now, you know,
Mhm.
and that we know what's best because we're in this industry and you came to partner with us because we're trying to actually sell books and not do a vanity project, you know, that and authors everywhere do that. They sort of inadvertently sabotage themselves. So my holding the line is hard both because it matters and sometimes it causes me to have to push back, but I feel like I do it from a very protective
You
place.
know what you're doing, right? You really are. You have a lot of experience. Is that typically around covers? I'm trying to think where authors going to be set.
Largely, yeah, largely around covers,
Yeah.
sometimes around other packaging decisions, um,
Mhm.
occasionally around editorial, though, of course, you know,
Mhm.
where someone is
Right.
just fighting for a scene, especially now in the age of sensitivity issues, a lot of
Uh,
stuff has come up
yeah.
around like, but that happened, you know, or but this character actually feels this way, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
fighting for these things that I'm just like, yeah, but
Yeah, and you have to say to people, I know what I'm doing, and
Right.
you're gonna have to listen to me, but holding your own can be
Yeah.
hard. Yeah, I
Yeah.
see it. And the best part, I'm sure, is, I mean, you're doing something incredible for women everywhere, right? I mean, you come from Seal, which is a feminist press.
Right.
So for you, it must be hugely satisfying to be lifting the voices of all these women.
It's the best, absolutely. And that was really the reason that I wrote that book you mentioned, Right On Sisters, which is all about my experience of working with women writers. And it's been a long time now. I started at Seal Press in 2000. Oh my gosh, when was that? I can't even remember. I think it was 2004. So it's been a lot of years of working exclusively with women and elevating women's voices, and the ways that that's so rewarding, and the ways that women get in their own way.
Right, right. Interesting. The ways women get in their own way. Wait, can you tell me a little bit more about
Imagine that.
how do we do that? Just give me a line or two on how we do that.
I mean, the entire book, the first part of the book is all about our conditioning, so we can sabotage ourselves. Women suffer with imposter syndrome. Women suffer from, just taking rejection too personally. There's just a million things, just different things that I kind of pulled into the book from my own experience with women. A lot of it just around kind of emotional over connection to their books too,
Mhm.
where that, and I think that's where I get into this stuff with some of my authors, is like they're so emotionally attached to something that they're not really thinking about the business aspect of it. So those are just some examples of many, but I talk about just the what we bring to our creative process that is, that sometimes we might need to re-examine or reframe.
Right, right. No, that sounds helpful in a lot of ways, not just in this context. And
Yeah.
are all of your books available through She Writes?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. You must have some were written before or no? Did you take back the
No, actually, my very first book, which is called What's Your Book, was the first book to be published on She Writes. And I did that intentionally to walk myself through the process. And because I had only ever been an acquisitions editor,
Mhm.
and there was a lot I didn't know. I mean, so much about the industry that I didn't know, particularly around distribution. So I put my own book through the process, and it was good that I did, because I made some mistakes, and I'm glad that I made the mistakes on my own book and not one of our authors.
Learned. How great. All right. And so for people listening, I think you should definitely be encouraged to check out the She Writes community, because within the community, as I understand, there are 400 subgroups, I think, or, lots of,
Right.
I would imagine, travel and YA, and I don't know. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. The She Writes community is out there. We also are active on Facebook, like most places, and our sites too, shewritespress.com and gosparkpress.com is the other one. Go Spark Press, not just Spark Press. And I'm very open to sharing stuff. I want people to understand the model. I'm, as much as I am the publisher of She Writes Press, I'm also a little bit of an evangelist about this third way publishing, because I do think it's important that people don't think that the world of publishing is self-publishing or traditional publishing. And a lot of people want to make that distinction, even when they understand that there's this middle ground, and so it is a nuanced ecosystem. And I think that that's important as we continue to see the consolidation of big publishing, that
Crazy.
people understand that there is a lot of other options, and it's not just one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people have been saying for a long time that big publishing is going to die, kind of the way the music industry died. And it hasn't happened yet, but it's certainly morphing in bizarre ways all the time. So I'm on the board of Spiegel and Grau, Cindy and Julie's new,
Oh, cool. Yeah.
which is exciting.
Congratulations to them.
Yeah, it's really exciting, but still that world it does feel like a dinosaur model. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, in a lot of ways, we're subject to that. I actually think the dinosaur model it's the real rub for publishing, is that part of what makes it a dinosaur is the distribution, and you need the distribution for the access. And so
Right.
we're going to have to figure that out as an industry, how to rethink distribution, not the least of which, like the biggest concern in my personal life, because I have a kid, is climate change. We publish way more books than we need, and then we pulp books, and there just has to be a way to rethink it.
Yeah, to print on demand. I mean, there is print on demand, right? With
but it's seen as lesser. I mean, it is lesser quality. And the industry doesn't like it. Bookstores sort of equate print on demand with self-publishing.
Right, right.
So there's just all these problems that need to get
Yeah.
addressed. We need a think tank. So maybe I'll approach you for that at some future.
Actually, my last question for you, because I'm also on the board of the Brooklyn Public Library, so we debate this stuff a lot. I mean, where do you fall in the, real books will be dead one day argument? Like, how do you feel about ebooks? How do you feel about real books?
I feel passionately about real books, and I would love for us to figure out how to print what we actually consume rather than printing in these ridiculously excessive numbers that we know will never sell because we accept returns and then they go into a landfill. That is what I like. Honestly, it can keep me up at night.
Yeah, no, it's really a problem.
And so I don't think print will ever be dead, but we must find a better way to do it. Otherwise, it's a limited resource.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, that makes the most sense. I actually never read ebooks ever. I've never read an ebook, which I feel embarrassed about, but I love books.
How
I'm
about
like a book.
audio? Do you do
I sometimes do audio in the car, but I really do love books and I love buying books. I feel like I'm supporting writers and I like them as objects. And I no longer, I used to, have millions and millions of bookshelves. I now see them, interestingly, a little bit more. Disposable is not the right word, but I do see them as I give them away. Like they come into my life and I give them
Yeah.
out. I don't hoard them as much. I only keep the books I really, really love now. I'm not sure why that changed, but
I think that's a signal of maturity or something. Just letting go of all these things, I mean, all these books that I have in my office are mainly my own arcs. But
right,
yeah, there's something about just keeping these books and I'll look at something and say, oh, I'm totally going to someday reread that book from
right.
1999, but I'm actually not going to because there's too much new stuff.
Right. It is a little bit of the Marie Kondo in me. Like I really only want to keep it around if it brings me joy. And with books, that's so clear cut. Like I love
Yeah,
this book. This one I don't care, didn't do it.
absolutely.
So this has been a great conversation, Brooke. I really appreciate it. And I think our listeners and viewers will really appreciate it and get a lot out of it. So thank you very much. And we will continue to be in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks so much
All
for
right.
having
Take
me.
care, everyone. Say goodbye to Brooke Warner from She Writes.
Bye, everybody.